over now, but children starting school aren't ready. That's coming from teachers. This was a 2022 School Readiness survey, and it sets out some key findings from an organisation called Kindred Squared, which is all things to children. They do some amazing stuff looking at early education with children, which is a really, really important thing. As you know, I keep raving on about Sure Start being closed down, and that was one of the biggest damages to this country as far as I'm concerned. But children are missing their developmental milestones because when they actually do turn out for schools, they're not ready for reception classes. Many pupils, this is out of this survey, many pupils are unable to use the toilet, unable to eat independently, and can't communicate clearly. This is according to this report from Kindred Squared. Joining me now is Felicity Gillespie, who's director at Kindred Squared. Felicity, this is alarming. Just take us through what sorts of things you're hearing from this report that are impeding children, what age we're talking about, and what are the things that this report has shone a light on.
Sure. I think the most startling thing this year in the data that we found is when we surveyed parents and teachers is the gap between the two. So what parents are saying, 9 out of 10 of them are saying their children are ready to go to school into reception when they're 4. But teachers are saying what they're seeing in the classroom is that it's nearer half. So we've got this big gap in understanding and knowledge about what's going on. And I think the numbers the things you referred to are absolutely to the point, that 40% of parents think it's wholly their responsibility, as opposed to the schools, to get their children eating independently. And only 60% think it's wholly their job to potty train. So again, we come back to this issue of knowledge and information and understanding. 95% of the teachers said parents need more information, because I think there is a real dearth of information, and maybe we can talk about that in a moment. But I think the biggest surprise is that we're saying that what we're seeing is that nearly half the children in the country are behind before they begin their school-based education, and that's not good for anyone.
But Felicity, potty trained at 4? At 4? Are you seriously telling me that children are starting school at 4 and they don't know how to go to the bathroom on their own? Or when you say eat independently, what does that mean? They have to be fed at 4 years of age? I've got the information here, but just flesh that out. What do we actually mean when I can understand if they can't communicate clearly, because if a parent is on a mobile phone or a tablet, or the parent's first language isn't English, and they're either isolated or they've gone through lockdown, because this was 2021, there would have been many families with kids starting school after lockdown. Okay, so I get that with the communication clearly. But when we talk about potty training and eating independently, just flesh out what that means the child can't do.
Okay, so 91% of teachers have at least one child in their class that is not toilet trained, which means they're either in nappies or they're out of nappies, but they're not able to cope during the day without having multiple accidents. So, and what eating independently means is that you can eat with a basic fork and utensils. You can feed yourself. You don't need help from an adult. And just to, on the point, Trisha, you made about COVID, absolutely, COVID's been difficult for many families in many ways. It's actually helped some families and some children spending more time with their parents at home. But I think what's really important is this was a problem before COVID, and this is too big a problem and too fundamental a problem for the whole of society to be written off as a kind of a consequence of COVID, or indeed something that's too hard to deal with during a cost of living crisis. This is actually about a fundamental reappraisal and conversation, I think, about parenting, which is, let's face it, really hard to do. Nobody wants to, we're all a bit squeamish about talking about parenting, because it sounds like, we might be, telling parents how to bring up their own children. And no one wants to do that. Yep. But it's about information and support. I think that's what we really need to look at.
Now, a lot of people are going to be saying, listening, how does a parent not know that their child needs to be potty trained? How does a parent not know that at 4 years they can eat on their own? Now, as I said before, I do bang on about Sure Start, probably because I was actually in a group called, I was doing work in the mental health prevention role in Australia, and we called it Triple P Parenting, and a group came over from the UK, worked with us, came back to the UK, and that was the beginnings of Sure Start, and I was kind of involved right from the beginning, and now with Home Start. So I'm actively involved in parenting. So I'm asking questions that I know the answer to, but I think ones that we should address. Absolutely. Now, something like Sure Start and places like that were non-judgmental about. That's what we're talking about here when you say we're a bit squeamish about parenting. What you need is non-judgmental information, isn't it? Or non-judgmental support.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is woefully lacking because of the squeamishness. We don't share information. Parents, it's quite hard for parents. And some of the support that's been there in the past, as you rightly point out, Sure Start centres aren't there anymore. And, you know, for instance, health visitors, let's talk about them. They're a key element of the support network for parents. But 1 in 4 are now missing out on their 2.5-year review, and 1 in 5 on their health and development reviews. So that source isn't there. Whoa. And also we know that access to high quality, affordable nursery places is just not an option for many parents. Even though, you know, 50% of mums who are not working would really like to, if childcare was an option. So those moments, those places of information aren't there. So I think we then need to go back to, well, okay, given that parenting, I think, has probably become a bit more of an isolated business. Few of us, you know, have extended family living down the road. And when you're time poor, it's hard. You know, it's easier to dress your 3-year-old when you're trying to get out the door than to wait for them to sort themselves out, isn't it? And also you go to the supermarket and there's the shelf of nappies, and you don't have to boil them on the top of the stove and, you know, have hellish time with safety pins and drying terry nappies. You've got these fantastically efficient, easy to put on, pull up pants and things. And they're in the supermarket up to, you know, 4, 5, 6 years of age. So it must be okay, right? I mean, they're there. So I think there's a whole lot of complicated sort of dynamics that don't make it that easy for parents who perhaps don't have the support and don't necessarily just know what is expected and what we mean by being school ready. Because it's not about, you know, being, you know, having a pencil and reading and all of that. It's about being able to do these basic things of playing and sharing and following simple instructions, being able to say your own name. You know, but it's age appropriate. It's about having that age appropriate information at the right time. And for parents to understand that to be school ready, you need to start at birth. You need to start with, you know, talking to your baby. It's not something that starts at 4.5 or 3.5. It's, you know, it's a whole conversation that I think we need to be getting into.
You make a very good point about parenting. And I mean, a lot of people listening will say in my day, but as you make the point of families were more likely to live together. So even if mum didn't know or have the time to talk to child, grandma or uncle or auntie would, there was ready advice. Nobody blamed you or anything like that. Might do it in the form of a joke. Those days no longer last. Now, one of the things, again, you touched about is the oral communication. As I said, I can understand if English is not the mother's first language. I've been in many situations. I remember when we used to have a house in Beckton in London, and I remember being at the post office, and a child who would have been about 4 or 5 was translating for their mother at the post office. So I can understand that the conversation that would be difficult. But let's look at the other thing you touched upon, which is being able to communicate and play and work together as a group. Now, what's labelled, well, what goes on to be antisocial behaviour, we know it doesn't start in teens. We know it starts at the beginning, and it doesn't start from a point of malevolence, does it? Just talk about that, because a lot of the policing, and it comes in policing, and the labelling happens in teens and later life without looking at the seeds of it.
Trisha, is such a brilliant point. You know, the truth is school readiness is not an early years problem. School readiness impacts all of us. because developmentally where you are at 22 months before you're even 2 is an accurate predictor of your educational attainment at 26 years. And for all of us as taxpayers, frankly, even if you don't have kids or grandkids, it's bonkers, the whole situation, because we know that for every pound that's invested in these early years in trying to close the gap and trying to get everyone on a sort of level playing field when they start school, every pound that we invest then saves £13 to the exchequer in terms of later interventions. So basically, whatever gap is there at 5 impacts the child, impacts the other children in the class who are ready, because you've got teachers spending between 2 and 3 hours a day not teaching the class because they're dealing with nappy changing and additional speech and language support for the children who can't perhaps say their own name. So, it affects them, and it affects all of us, because half the children are behind before they begin, and the older they get, the harder it is to close that gap, the more expensive it is, the tougher it is for schools, the more of their resources they're spending on closing the gap that should have never really been opened, But I think sort of societal understanding and awareness that actually the be all and end all of a successful education system isn't your GCSEs and your A-level grades and who goes to a Russell Group university. It's actually who gets a fair crack of the whip, who gets to access the full range of opportunities and to really thrive and flourish right from the beginning of their education.
Yeah, and that's the thing. If you label a child, or a child feels labelled at the beginning through no fault of their own, because they don't know how to behave in class, they don't know how to eat, if you label that child, we know that label will stay with that child and influence their behaviour all the way through school. It goes on their school report, and that follows them for a very, very long time. So you're absolutely right. So what needs to change? If you could wave a magic wand, I always ask people this, if you could wave a magic wand and actually get the ear of a politician who is in tune with society, I don't know where you're going to find one of those right now, but still, if you could wave a magic wand, what do you think needs to change?
Well, golly, how long you got?
Headlines, just
there's a huge money problem, right? The childcare and education sector is chronically underfunded. Even by the Department for Education's own numbers, it is underfunded. So that's a huge issue, and that's obstructing families that want to get that access and that support, that they can't. So that's a big issue. I think there's something about information to parents. So let's stop being squeamish about talking about parenting. Let's see providing information about what we're talking about when we say developmental milestones, and what's a reasonable sort of trajectory of development for a baby from birth. Let's get that information out there. Let's use those points of contact, whether it's through midwives or healthcare visitors, or whether it's your 22-week scan, whether it's your 2.5. Let's use the points of contact we have to share information. And then I think the bigger picture is we're not going to change the attitude that we have. We're not going to turn into a Scandinavian country that, prioritizes early education, and then, bingo, Estonia is now got the highest of all the OECD countries, has got the highest achievement at 15, whereas 40% of our attainment gap at GCSE is evident at 5. We're not going to make that change overnight. And I think having a fundamental reappraisal across society, programs like this, being able to talk about these things without sort of feeling like, without parents feeling that we're finger wagging, we're here to try and help and support, but that's what we've got to start doing.
Absolutely. And you touched upon Estonia there, and it's no coincidence Estonia has the best childcare as well. So, I mean, the two link up. And, I couldn't agree with you more. Governments are spending money saving people who've fallen off the cliff when it would be a lot cheaper to build fences at the top. That's what I always say it comes back to. Felicity, an absolute pleasure talking to you, and you're absolutely right. Maybe we should get together on a future show and talk about parenting and what is good, what is helpful parenting and what isn't helpful parenting, because I hate that label of good and bad, because that shuts down a lot of conversation, and it shuts down people gaining access to information that they really, really need. Felicity Gillespie, their director of Kindred 2, with some really fantastic points. If you're thinking about things like antisocial behavior and all of those things, if you're finger wagging about, older people, teens and what they're doing, remember it starts at early childhood. And unless we put the money, unless we put the resources, unless we shine the spotlight on that, we haven't got a hope in hell. Felicity, a delight talking to you, and I hope we will again. After this short break, we'll see if we've got any more phone calls. I think